Malta is a beautiful country which has gone through 3 sieges. The first, the Great Siege of Malta. The second, the siege imposed by the Nazis and the Italian fascists. And the third siege, the siege by dark money. And for this siege, the Maltese are in danger of losing completely and utterly. They need to wake up and fight this enemy of dark money and clean up the place.
As a journalist, I was always taught to follow the money, and Joseph Muscat certainly followed the money as soon as he left politics. And it's not like he's doing consultancies for Greenpeace and like charities and all that. From the very first moment I had kind of come across these payments, these suspect payments to Joseph Muscat, and published first story and started asking Roberta Bella questions about it. You could tell he was of two minds of what should he do here. Should he just completely cut ties and throw Joseph Muscat under the bus?
In May 2024, former Prime Minister Joseph Muscat and his associates and colleagues were charged for corruption in the hospitals deal.
Daphne was always the first source of information for all the deals. And the government never dealt with her accusations. What they did was they turned their guns on her, and that really raised alarm bells to me. It seemed that the government was permanently in damage control. Every time Daphne revealed a story, they just went after her.
I think it was a slow burning thing. Obviously, nobody wants to diss any health project that promises to improve healthcare. And once a deal is done, it takes time for those results to be evident. But what became evident over the years is that the deal was never going to deliver.
In general, Joseph Muscat's government was very dismissive of any press reporting. They'd often ignore it. They either ignore it or they'd sue. those two extremes. When I first caught wind of the secret MOU that was signed before the actual tender, I had actually managed to get a hold of a presentation by the investors that referenced it, and this was dated before the actual tender. So these guys were already saying we're going to be given the 3 hospitals. And how is that possible? So I'd filed an FOI request for this MOU, and the government spent close to 2 or 3 years fighting me tooth and nail. It ended up going all the way to the appeals court, which I lost.
The National Audit Office confirmed press reports on the MOU, stories the government had denied. In 2020, the NAO published its first report on the deal.
When you're constantly either getting stonewalled or getting very heavy pushback from the government, it's natural for self-doubt to creep in. So I was almost relieved when the first NAO report said this MOU is clear evidence of collusion. So it's it wasn't just a figment of my imagination or a fixation.
The official reports confirmed what we already knew. The deal was corrupt from the start, so the results were not very surprising. It's the details that perhaps we weren't clear on, but a corrupt deal is a corrupt deal is a corrupt deal.
It is quite, deluding that this report came so late, because it does show that there is a civil service that is lacking. Therefore, the controls and the checks and balances are not there, or not there quickly enough.
Daphne Caruana Galizia was the first to raise red flags about the story based on information she received from a source. So over the years, a lot of pieces of the puzzle have come out.
In 2022, OCCRP got heavily involved in Malta. The investigative journalists obtained a data set of transactions related to companies behind the hospitals deal.
What we had in our hands was something rare and new. It's not very often you get banking information from companies that very much shows you where the money was coming from and going.
Eventually, the obvious failure of the concession was too much to ignore. After a lengthy court case filed by opposition MP Adrian Delia, the court rescinded the deal twice, declaring it fraudulent and illegal. The criminal court case against Joseph Muscat, Chris Fern and the rest of the former associates and colleagues remains ongoing.
Alarm bells go off when you see payments and transactions that have nothing to do with public health care and hospitals. Later, we obtained another data set that included transactions, and we were able to see spending by the companies on things like political consultants that insisted previously that they had nothing to do with the concession, as well as spending on business intelligence or, in fact, spying on critics that were investigating the company.
It is important to keep a kind of watchdog look onto how the Attorney General's office is dealing with this. It's very important to keep tabs on this because the Attorney General herself hasn't really made a great show, has she, up to now?
I'd heard of Daphne's work before, but I wasn't a close student of it. But, you know, when you got into the story, first of all, you know, the assassination by car bomb, that was brutal. But when you understood who she was targeting, it was effectively the entire Labour government of Joseph Muscat in Malta, from him down, and from his closest possible associates. And a couple of months later, I interviewed him in person, and he said, you know, well, actually, you know, apart from Daphne's family, I'm the greatest victim in all of this. And I thought that was an unbearably arrogant thing to say, and very wrong.
It was never just a hospital steal. There's a power station tainted with corruption, a fraudulent university that hoovered up prime public land, and Maltese passports are still up for sale. That's just 4 of the big ones at the bottom of the pile of smaller scandals coming out every other week. Joseph Muscat denies all wrongdoing, and his successor's government is none the wiser.
Daphne hadn't just written one article critical of Joseph Muscat. It was like a tsunami of them. It was a torrent of them. And there was real and serious weight. There was heft to her stories. Now, but the essential charge was that Joseph Muscat had used his control over the machinery of the Maltese government to enrich himself and his cronies. I think that was absolutely established, which is why at the end of the interview, I said, well, some people call you the artful dodger of Europe. And there's a way when politicians, you know, when you've socked them hard, they smile at you, but the smile never reaches their eyes. And that was the thing that struck me about Joseph Muscat.
What was your initial gut feeling about the electrogas deal?
There's a difference between the electrogas deal and the hospitals deal, because the electrogas deal was evident before it actually was a deal. There were intimations in all the rhetoric and propaganda we heard before the 2013 election. The lead up to it, if you read the information and you read between the lines of the propaganda pitches, is that we're building up towards something that was going to happen in the energy sector. And it became a running joke. Who's paying for the Labour campaign? People would say, min ħajkollu power station. The devil, as they say, is in the detail. When you ask somebody what is going to be the unit cost of electricity, you give a guesstimate of between this amount and this amount. You don't say something like 7 cents, 5 mils, or something of the sort. You cannot be that precise unless you already have a very clear idea of what you're going to be doing and who you're going to be working with. And that kind of conclusion only comes out of a conversation you're having, which shouldn't happen before an election. It should happen afterwards, if at all.
Probably the first time I started to make links to, you know, like the local businessmen and all that was when the Panama Papers came out, because we found out that there were these super secretive structures set up by Conrad Mitzi and Keach Kembry, who had gotten this tip about the payments. The plan was for the payments to come to 17 Black, and that's when kind of the circle fully closed, when together with Reuters had established that 17 Black was owned by Jürgen Fenech, who, you know, was the man behind Electrogas. So he had a very clear planned flow of funds. You know, Jürgen Fenech, 17 black, Konrad Mitzi, Kemper. Oh, that's...
Your gut feeling on electrogas?
My focus is on court, so the NAO reports and and the political fallout was something, again, I was just peripherally aware of. So it really started to come together for me in the public inquiry into Daphne's murder. It started to come together in my head, all these loose threads of vague dodginess, and they're like woven into a tapestry of the worst kind of avarice and corruption. The public inquiry was actually almost a relief that, the boil had started to be lanced. Although, I didn't have high hopes that things are going to change, and good thing I didn't, because they haven't. But it started, it set the ball rolling. And if there's nothing that I've learned in these years observing this process, it's that you have to be very patient. Things take time, change takes time. It takes a while to get people's head round to your way of thinking, and to seeing the light after they've been gaslit and misled for so many years.
What about AUM? What was your gut feeling about that?
I heard of the American University of Malta when it was announced, and I immediately did not believe the educational intention behind it. First of all, because the people who were creating a university had no idea of a university. They were people in construction, perhaps in the hospitality industry, but certainly not in the job of setting up universities. The first big red alarm bell was the fact that after 6 months that professors and lecturers who had left their jobs in America or elsewhere came to Malta, they were sacked. What on earth is going on here? What sense did that make?
We today have yet another proof that Malta's living success is all down to hard work and bold decisions.
Why is the Prime Minister getting involved in launching a university project? Why? Why at all? The really interesting angle was the land deal. Why all that land, and why that particular land, and why that particular deal? At best, it was just cack-handed. It was just a bad deal for Malta. And that's the best you can say about it.
When did you first hear of AUM?
My first recollection of hearing about it, I think it was there was a protest at Zon or Point in about 2015. I think it was organized by Marlene Farrugia. Again, I had only just started off in journalism at the time, and I had pretty much zero awareness of the backstory or the politics involved. It was an eye-opener, though, for sure.
It was not about the university, it was about the land involved and what that would have meant, long term. Malta has a limited land size, and we're giving prime land with a seafront view away in a project that we didn't know what the possible outcome would be.
Everywhere you looked, it was the same pattern. Golden passports are no different. A minority of people with the right kind of access stood to get very rich at your expense. And boy, they did.
The Malta Individual Investor Program is the most exclusive in the world. Adhering to the strictest due diligence standards, it is also the only program of its kind to be endorsed by the EU.
It's just an immoral practice. Not only that, but it enabled the government to get millions of euros for doing fuck all and selling something that was only valuable because of our EU membership, which they had opposed so strongly. It just disgusts me.
In my greenhorn naivety, thinking at the time, why would anyone want to buy a Maltese passport? We're not, buy an American passport or a British passport.
Why does anyone want to buy one in the first place? It's because the passport they have obviously has problems. And by buying citizenship, you bypass the checks and balances of a system that is meant to raise red flags and be looked into. So a passport that raises alarm, you end up with a passepartout because you have actually paid for it. And you're no longer subject to those controls.
Daphne was the first to expose the extent of corruption behind the government's plan to sell passports.
I mean, I wouldn't say the Labour Party of Malta is a normal political party. It's more like a cult. And they're using the power of this cult to enrich themselves. And effectively, Daphne Caruana Galizia became the leader of the opposition. The police were siding with the cult and its machinery of corruption. And the police and the judiciary and all of the institutions in Malta charged with defending the country against corruption were in some way corrupted by the corruption. So that you've got only one person who was taking tremendous risks that ended with her murder, to try and tell the truth.
We know we're putting ourselves on the radar of potential journalist killer, so it was very tense few weeks.
Hospitals, an entire country's power supply, prime public land, identity. If nothing is sacred, then what do we have? What is the government doing today? What are they on about? And where are we going?
Speaking as someone who is interested in current affairs, obviously, because I'm a journalist, but who doesn't follow politics obsessively, the government stance isn't clear to me, unless look at what these jealous nationalists, NGOs / evil magistrate concocted to harm us. Your government, but we totally respect the rule of law and separation of powers, okay, and the courts. If that's a stance, if that qualifies as a stance, that seems to be it, from what I can see. On a more serious note, it has led to a divide in the Labour Party between Muscat diehards, loyalists, who are more vocal, and the more moderate Abela supporters who probably want to seal Muscat's legacy in a lead casket and cast it into the deep.
And it's fascinating to see the government scrambling around to try and figure out how to distance themselves from the criminal charges, while at the same time trying to avoid saying that Muscat is a crook, of course. There is no joy in it or satisfaction or celebrations, but although we always knew that we were right in what we were saying, you always have doubts about whether you should be speaking out so strongly about things. And when you see what's happening now, it's just proof that we were right all along, and that Daphne was right, even more to the point.
I think at very least Malta needs to implement the recommendations of the public inquiry into Daphne's assassination. The reason for that is that it was the only way for the state to learn how to prevent future deaths. Now, I've heard people say that situation has changed, but the fact is those recommendations weren't implemented yet. And it's very important that we implement not just the ones about journalism, but the ones about corruption and organized crime.
And just to clarify, none of them have been implemented?
No. Not implemented. The government has overturned an attempt to implement them.
At every turn, Robert Abela's promises that institutions will be allowed to prosecute corruption have never materialized. Instead, the party's machinery just entrenched itself further.
In terms of the government fallout, it's been fascinating watching Robert Abela, the current Prime Minister, having to straddle between what I'm sure he knows is an obviously rotten deal.
Nemmen li dik hija mansjoni tal-maġistrat inkwirenti u skont il-konklużjonijiet li tasal għalihom. Dik il-maġistrat naturalment wieħed imbagħad aħna lek nirrispettaw l-istituzzjonijiet u l-istituzzjonijiet tajnhom ir-riżorsi kollha sabiex jaħdmu.
The tightrope and knowing that he can't bend Joseph Muscat either.
Dan ma ninsewx dad-diċeriji li l-om jiġru ġewwa l-kuriduri tal-qrati u ġewwa ċriki politiċi partikolarment tan-naħa tal-oppożizzjoni illi l-eluq tal-inkjesta se jkoinċidi b'mod preċiż biex issir ħsara massima liċ-ċansijiet elettorali tal-Partit Laburista ilna nisimgħuh ix-xhur.
It's almost painful to watch, and at the end of the day he's going to have to pick a side at some point. He can't just keep on straddling.
How would you describe the scale of the fraud and corruption in the hospital's concession?
But I have to say it's heartbreaking to see the impact on the public, especially when you're dealing with public funds for something as critical as healthcare. It's pretty devastating.
And what do you make of how the present administration has handled all of this?
What we've observed is public officials, current and former, really politicizing this investigation. And this seems to be a trend around the world in politics where any investigation is colored as a witch hunt. And I think this is really a problem for democracy.
They failed to do anything about the hospital's concession. The courts had to take action, and the criminal case will likely take years. With the other deals, it's even worse.
What do you make of the aftermath of the electrogas deal?
I would describe it as a process of bluffing and bullying. That is exactly what the government has been doing. It keeps hoping that people will forget until they continue to protect these people and until nobody, absolutely nobody, is made accountable for this deal.
What about the American University of Malta deal? Has anyone faced repercussions?
No prosecutions, nothing. Nothing's happened.
In fact,
And there has not been any clawback of what the party to the deal acquired in the deal itself. The project is not functioning, but they still control the land. And they control the project, and they have the rights that they originally acquired in the deal. But they have not met its conditions, and nothing, as far as I know, has been done to take those assets back and renationalize them.
Worst of all, Joseph Muscat and his associates had agreements in place to continue abusing the influence obtained through their office, years after the public hit the streets and kicked them out.
We got a lot of information on Joseph Muscat's various consultancies. I was always interested after he left politics to see, whether he would start cashing in on the acts he did in government. One of the ones I came across was this, with this Chinese firm, or Chinese-owned firm. It's actually a Maltese firm. And, I actually got the tip off that Joseph Muscat was kind of being seen every few weeks going by car to this place in Marsa. A neighbor told me about it, and I sort of looked into the address and all that, and I managed to confirm with some sources that it was one of his many consultancy contracts. You've got Akita, that's linked to the hospitals. Organicum, he was a consultant for an exotic bird company that's linked to another deal in government, casinos. He was a consultant for Fortina, consultant for Stivala, and a consultant for Mr. Wang, Jing Wang.
Years of abuse have taken their toll, particularly on the media's right to freely exercise its role as a public watchdog, a right which Daphne fought so hard to preserve. Is there even a future for the press in Malta?
There is a future. I mean, there is a free press, sort of. Now, there are people attempting to do journalism. What we don't have is an environment which you say enables free journalism. The other fact is that the media landscape is changing. The old models aren't working, so that has to be taken into account as well.
Can journalists do anything about this?
The hostility towards journalism is not entirely the responsibility of journalists. It's a bit like saying people who are victims of racism are responsible for resolving the problem. So that's the first thing we have to do. People need to recognize that journalism has a role in a democracy. This is why the public inquiry recommendations are important. If they are implemented, they will move Malta closer to democratic norms.
Once people started looking properly, and this is obviously with outside help, the FBI, the European police, Europol, pressure from Europe, from the Council of Europe too as well, that this pressure has forced the truth out. And the truth is that the Maltese government under Joseph Muscat was grotesquely corrupt. And that's the simple, plain truth of it. that Malta and the Maltese government under Joseph Muscat was grotesquely corrupt. But people in London and New York and Rome and Paris and Berlin they were enabling and empowering this corruption because Malta has become a sluice for dirty money.
With all its enablers from outside and within the country, will we ever see the end of the mafia state?
I think the government is desperately trying to find a way to get out of it without implicating itself in what's going on in the courts. So there are a lot of stories about what's going on in the back rooms of the party, or how true or otherwise they are, I don't know. But I have to continue to hope that somehow we will get out of this mafia web. Otherwise, what's the point of continuing to fight? We can just stop and clear the memorial and stop going and stop protesting and stop having vigils.
Do you feel satisfied with the work you've done so far? Do you feel like you can call it quits yet, or do you feel like you've still got more to accomplish?
Well, I'd promised myself that I'd call it quits the day that Joseph Muscat is charged, but I'm still here, so I guess there's still more work to be done.
Dark money can flow so much faster that the policemen in their heavy boots can catch them. And we need to make lighter boots for the policemen, and we need to make it harder for the dark money to flow. So the reason why Daphne Caruana Galizia is no longer with us is that she pointed out these discrepancies with a ferocious wit and an absolute moral clarity, and the dark money didn't like it. I don't think things will improve until that government falls. And this is the power of modern social media and the collapse of proper legacy journalism means that not enough people properly understand that if you support the government of the current government, you're supporting the cult of Joseph Muscat. And it has to go.